an unfinished work of literature, an archive of descriptive history. Your body and your genome can be read as a comprehensive dossier on a succession of colourful worlds long vanished, worlds that surrounded your ancestors long gone, a genetic book of the dead.
Ian, there was a time when to be an atheist was considered to be somewhat eccentric, and I think that's still very true in America. Yet in the sort of scientific circles in which I move, and I would guess the literary circles in which you move, just about everybody we meet is an atheist. Would that be your impression?
Yes, strangely enough, I'm pretty sure everyone around me is an atheist, but they don't describe themselves as such. It's almost as if the questioners have fallen off the edge of the world. It's no longer...
Just not worth bothering to even talk about.
No, they don't... no one goes around saying, I am an atheist. No. And
any more than we say, I don't believe in Thor and Wotan and Zeus.
Or phlogiston.
Yes, quite.
I mean, it just is not a matter that comes up. I have one or two friends who sustain some kind of belief in a Godhead. They don't attend churches. And that's clear to me through their writing. And it's almost as if one is a little embarrassed to ever broach this with them.
For fear of hurting their feelings? Or?
Well, it's a sort of sensitive place. It's almost as if they would rather you... I get the sense they'd rather one didn't talk about this.
But in America, the other way around.
Yes, although I have to say all my American friends, who are literary friends on the whole, are exactly the same. I mean, they live in that other culture in America where God just simply doesn't come into the picture.
Well, mine too, and yet it's essentially impossible for an atheist to get elected to Congress.
Yes, I mean, the world of politics. And that's very odd in a country that has a constitution and whose founding fathers staked out a world quite distinct from the religious absolutism of old Europe. Odd how religion has come in through a kind of back door of a kind of blackmail. You cannot be in high office in politics without...
in America, of all places, that had a wholly secular foundation. Very sad.
And America that owns most of the world's science and most of the internet too, yes.
And like you, essentially, indeed all my American friends practically are atheists, but as with the English ones, don't bother to say so.
I suppose this just points to the ways in which we swim in our little tanks, socially and professionally, and we don't get out and about enough, I guess.
Yeah. Have you always been an atheist, or did you sort of have a religion at one time in your life?
Well, my parents both came from Protestant sort of Church of England, Church of Scotland backgrounds, but they weren't devout in any sense. My father was in the army. There was the occasional garrison church event to which we were all very much required to attend. I used to carry the flag in the Boy Scouts and felt the sort of solemnity of it all. And then around about the age of 11 or 12, I began to feel that I must, every night before falling asleep, mentally run through everyone I loved and who was close to me and my family and ask for their protection. And it became a matter of real fear that if I missed it out, something terrible would happen. And it was like a self-made religion. It was rather
like stepping on the cracks.
Exactly.
Yes.
That feeling that if you went under that ladder or stepped on that crack, something terrible would happen. And this is the point, it would be all your fault.
Yes.
And I kept at that for a couple of years, and it was my way of falling asleep. But it was not a positive thing. It was really like holding off the demons. Please don't let anything bad happen to my mother or to my father or to my sister. And I would have to go through them in the right order.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, in my early 20s, some moments on tops of mountains with mescaline, thinking the whole thing seems to be speaking to me. And perhaps there's a purpose and a design to it, and I really ought to open my mind up to it. But I never really was able to sustain that for more than a few hours. And And then, yes, a couple of cracks at... I read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience and thought I'm going to have another go at this. And this was in my early 30s, and dickered around the edges of New Age sorts of things, but could never really go very far with it. I couldn't... My interest in science and got in the way all the time, actually. I couldn't sustain a proper religious worldview.
So what are your beliefs now?
Well, I guess my starting point would be that I think that the brain is responsible for consciousness, and that even though we know very little yet about how that is made for us, this inward cinema, we could be reasonably sure that when that brain ceases to be, when it falls apart and decomposes, that'll be the end of us. From that, quite a lot of things follow. I think, especially morally, we are the very privileged owners of a brief spark of consciousness. It probably came about by accident. It is a wonderful gift. There is nowhere else. There is no one else up there. This is our only time. And we therefore have to take responsibility for it. Responsibility for ourselves and responsibility for other people. In other words, I think an atheistic worldview puts considerable constraints on you. You cannot rely, as Christians or Muslims do, on a world elsewhere, a paradise to which one can work towards and maybe make sacrifices, and crucially make sacrifices of other people. Similarly, I don't believe in a paradise in earth in the form of a Marxist utopian state, for which also terrible things happen. When people believe, as Isaiah and Berlin and many others have pointed out, when people believe there's this utopia to be gained, then it's perfectly rational to slaughter millions to get there in order for the rest of mankind to be happy forever. So I think that there is an important moral center to believing that this is it, this is all we've got, this life, and we should make it the best we can for others and ourselves.
I profoundly agree with you, but there would be many religious people who think almost the opposite, that without a God, without a supernatural being to look at what they're doing and monitor what they're doing, they don't see any reason to bother to be good. They don't see any reason not to go out and steal and rape and do horrible things for purely selfish reasons.
Yes, I've always found that a curious view. I mean, it seems quite clear to me we are sort of instinctively moral.
Sorry, can you just start that again just about that? Sorry,
That's always seemed to me a very odd view. I think we are instinctively moral beings, moral animals, as it were. We have a marvelous gift, and you see it develop in children quite wondrously, opening up and becoming more sophisticated. This ability to become aware that other people have minds just like your own and feelings that are just as important as your own. And this gift of empathy, this sense of knowing what it's like to be someone else, and that you can't be cruel to them because you don't want them to be cruel to you, seems to me to be the building block of our moral system. We need that instinctual imagination that can carry us into the minds of others, around which we build a very complicated web of moral understanding. And it's not confined clearly to human animals. We see it in troops of bonobos and chimpanzees, observed with a strong sense of hierarchies and notions of revenge and alliances forming and breaking. We've been social animals for many millions of years, and it's quite clear that religions simply capture that sense and codify it, sometimes in quite magnificent ways. I mean, even as an atheist, I accept that it was quite a remarkable step to build a religion around the idea of love.
Turning the other cheek. And
yes, I mean, these are quite extraordinary things in the nature of human conduct. But I certainly don't think that it needs a God to ordain our moral priorities for us. I think we can do that perfectly well, and it's quite clear that we do. I mean, our laws are secular above all.
And we did before religion came along. And as you pointed out, religion came on afterwards and used the original morality that was instinctively there.
Yes, I mean, whether religion came along or whether these things always ran in parallel, we'll never know. I suspect that our sense of the supernatural workings of the world probably began at the dawn of consciousness, and we could never untangle this.
I find myself deeply agreeing with you as a fellow human being, using the same gift of empathy. As a Darwinian, however, it's slightly more difficult to understand. I mean, I think I can kind of do it, but I sometimes do wonder where this profound sense of empathy, this utter inability to be happy when another creature is suffering, which we all have, where that precisely comes from. I think we can make a Darwinian story, but it's not totally obvious.
Well, clearly, we're a social animal. We desire to cooperate. We have these social emotions like anger and revenge, which punish defectors, to use the current jargon for these things. And we clearly need ways of being in small, crowded groups without getting on each other's nerves, as it were, and being able to read someone else's emotions from their facial expression does seem to me like sort of a wondrous gift, but you can see how necessary it is when you come across, for example, an autistic child who can't do these things. Autistic children or severely autistic children do lack that moral sense that gives them their sort of immediate sociability, that human stuff. The coldness that people sometimes report of autistic children has something to do, I think, from that withdrawal they have from the moral stage. They simply don't seem to know that you're like them. Perhaps in fact, of course, you're not.
Yes. So I could put it like this. In the same way as we understand what sex is about reproduction, but it shows itself in the form of love, in the form of what Shakespeare wrote about in Romeo and Juliet. In the same way, the Darwinian imperative to reciprocate, to play cooperation games in a Darwinian sense, manifests itself, the equivalent of love, manifests itself in this empathy and sympathy and vicarious suffering when we see another creature suffering.
Yes, I mean, it's true that when you have one of the Darwinian explanations of why, for example, love exists, and we talk about the extraordinary long-term vulnerability of an human infant and how love is important in the nurturing and love between, the parents of this child, very important for its survival. That does not give you the content. It might give you the cause. And often people sweep aside these Darwinian explanations because they think you're saying that's all love is. But actually all you're doing is saying, well, how about this as a hypothesis that would fit the general scheme of an adaptation? But you're not actually saying, what is it like to be in the inward cinema of a man or a woman who's falling in love? That is a glorious experience, which is actually quite hard to explain in simply the way that consciousness itself is hard to explain. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do all the things we do, but not be aware of ourselves.
Yes.
I mean, that's the real mystery.
That is a profound problem.
Yes. And just behind that is another question, is why does anything exist at all? But that brings me to another point about being an atheist. And I must say I do hate this term. It seems so negative, but maybe we can talk about that too. That these mysteries are not beyond some kind of unwrapping. And one of the problems I began to have in my mid-20s with religion was that if you have a sacred text that tells you how the world began or what the relationship is between this sky god and you, it does curtail your curiosity, your sense of wanting to unwrap these mysteries. you simply say, well, it's a mystery, or the mind of God, no one can read it, or God moves in mysterious ways. It cuts off a source of wonder. And again, I would want to claim for atheists a much greater and livelier sense of interest and connection with the world, a sense of its wonders, but it's wonders that are amenable to our curiosity and that they could and can be enwrapped by them and can be with delight take one step on the basis of someone else's work to unfold just one more aspect of how curious and complex and lovely the world is. The loveliness of the world in its wondrousness is not apparent to me in Islam or Christianity and all the other major religions. It seems to me as if it's like mentally you tie a hand behind your back. You close off the free, inquiring spirit.
I've always felt that one of the things that's wrong with religion is precisely that it closes off curiosity. It teaches us to be satisfied with answers which are not really answers at all. And I'm very glad you think the same. But a moment ago, you said that you hated the word atheist, and because it sounded so negative. I agree with you. And I'm wondering what we can do about this. How can we put a more positive spin on atheism?
Well, I think we have to stop calling it atheism. I know you are associated with a project to start calling atheists bright, or were you?
Ian, I think we both agree that the word atheist is an unfortunate word because it sort of sounds negative. It's defined by a negative. But could we be a bit more positive about the sort of life that an atheist can lead?
Well, it would be handy to get rid of the term, simply because it is entirely God-centered. I'm sure that bishops don't like to refer to themselves as a-Darwinists or a-rationalists. But of course, even attempts to call atheists bright, and I know that you were associated with this project for a while, fail because language isn't corralled in this way, and thank goodness, actually, we can't legislate for
Yes, thank goodness, but I mean, it occasionally is. I mean, the word gay is the precedent which the Bright movement tried to
But no one made a decision about that.
I know.
And it just came about, and it just showed you can't quite herd it along in the way...
Well, I shouldn't write off the Brights just yet. I mean, I don't know how quickly the gays got going.
I can't quite bring myself to call myself bright.
You can call yourself a bright.
I don't mind calling religious people dim, on the other hand. That's fine. But no, there is a problem about a term. But, I mean, beyond that, I do think that one great mistake, and maybe this is a legacy of the Romantic era, is that we think that all the great feelings of transcendence that you might get in the face of a marvelous piece of art, or the awe you feel in front of a landscape, or the wonderful oceanic sense you have when you feel love for someone, we have this idea that somehow these are incompatible with being rational.
Yes.
And this is a great problem. There is nothing paradoxical about a rational man or woman falling in love or swooning in front of a Michelangelo. These are the great and wonderful emotions of being an adult human being. Somehow, this terrible word spiritual comes up when one's talking to people about one's beliefs, and people say, well, if you're an atheist, you can't have any spirituality. Well, I don't quite know any longer what people mean by it, but if they do mean the great oceanic feelings, the transcendence, the awe, and I would say, well, I feel that when I go to hear Andreas Schiff playing the Bach Goldberg variations, and I feel it when I'm striding along a high mountain edge in the Rockies. I don't call it spiritual, but I mean, for the sake of just settling a small disagreement, I'm prepared to go along with it. But that's the problem, that somehow to be an atheist is to be a cold logician or a denier of something, rather than someone who says, This is the great gift, short spark of life in an eternity of oblivion before and after. And we must celebrate it and try and improve it for everyone else around us and take our responsibilities for it.
Of course, I absolutely agree. There's an odd moment, not an odd moment, a typical moment at the end of an Aldous Huxley novel, I think it's Point Counterpoint, where one of the characters plays a late Beethoven quartet on the gramophone as a proof of the existence of God. And he almost persuades his audience. And it's utterly irrelevant, of course. I mean, Beethoven is marvellous if there's a God, and Beethoven is marvellous if there isn't a God, and it doesn't make any difference one way or the other.
What he proves is the existence of Beethoven.
Exactly, yes.
That's about it.
And very wonderful that is.
Yes.
And as you say, we must make the most of Beethoven and everything else during the short time we have got to do so.
They were very lucky when, some chance combinations of genes and a childhood experience or whatever it is throws up, a Mozart or a Beethoven or a Shakespeare. And we must, as you say, celebrate them. We don't need a God to help us do that. But there is this problem when you confront someone of deep faith. We do not, for some reason or other, we do not accept that religions are simply making statements about the world which may be either true or false, and that when people talk about physics or history or politics, we feel we can pitch in with our understanding. And as I think Sam Harris says in his rather feisty book, if you wrote a book on history or physics or mathematics and someone came up with a review of it that said, it's rather wrong about this point, you said, yes, but that's my history.
Yes.
I mean, these are my physics. Yes. You mustn't criticize it because you wound me.
Yes.
Well, likewise, I mean, religion surely has to take its place in the world of ideas. And if someone says, well, praying, for example, this mental exercise of asking for special favors and trying to determine future outcomes by obeisances towards the sky god, the praying works. Well, if it's proved to be so, then we must change our science. We must absorb it into everything we know. There's very little that suggests to me that it does, and that children with cancer sometimes die for all the prayers of their parents, and some children live, and some good people die, and other bad people thrive, and it's completely random.
And if it did work, if it wasn't completely random, that would be a matter of objective fact, which would be very interesting. You can investigate it.
Then you'd have to get investigated.
Yes, and that would be, of course, could be done.
Yeah, there would be a lifetime's professorship there.
But you're right, that isn't done because it's somehow thought to be impolite or ungracious, somehow going against social convention to even raise the question. It's some sort of rude to somebody to question their religion in a way that you would never hesitate to question their politics or their taste in football teams or anything like that.
I was at dinner sitting quite close to the Archbishop of Canterbury a few months ago, and I was aware that here was a man with very specific beliefs. I was sitting at dinner with the Archbishop of Canterbury a few months ago, and it did cross my mind that we could have a conversation about what he believed and what I believed. But I was completely awed by him, to be quite honest. I mean, he's a man of exceptional intelligence, and given all the usual constraints of ever raising the matter of someone's faith, and on top of that was the fact that he seemed to me a man of some considerable intellect. So it was a great relief to go nowhere near religion at all, instead talk about poetry, about which he knows a lot and clearly takes a great deal of pleasure from. But it's true that we cannot somehow face faith as simply a set of statements about the world that could be contested or agreed. we step around it. There was an Islamist in court just last week who pointed out to the court that this was very inconvenient to be here arraigned, actually a very serious set of offences, because it was an important day in the Holy Calendar. And to my amazement, I read that the judge cravenly apologised. I mean, it just seemed ludicrous. Any more that he should apologise for bringing someone into court for emergency session on a Sunday if they were a Christian. I mean, if you've broken the law, you've broken the law.
And it wouldn't have happened if it had been a Christian, would it? I mean, there is a sort of...
I get that feeling that
Yes.
we are not entirely free to talk about Islam anymore.
Yes.
I mean, we might have our freedoms being nibbled away at one end by the government in terms of civil liberties and balanced against our security, but we also are in a situation now when, to be really frank about Islam would cause you to look a little nervously behind you, as it were. We are not entirely free to discuss this subject.
And also...
I rather resent this.
Yes, I do too. But also, in the case of Islam, there is the spectre of racism as well, and the fact that many people confuse opposition to Islam with racism, and no decent liberal wants to be a racist.
Yes, I know that people are tying themselves in knots over this. And I think that's why it's important to have good, clear sort of values. In other words, the judge apologising to this man in such terms seemed to me to have missed the point of what he stood for, which was to treat everyone equally in the face of the law. And Muslims, Christians and atheists must all be judged by the same measure. But yes, I mean, we do have a real problem here. Christians do not really believe in the Bible. That's why, one can be a little more relaxed around them. They don't believe in every word of the Bible. I mean, a great deal of Leviticus and Corinthians is full of the most poisonous and murderous intolerance. And clearly the Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't believe a word of it. Islam is at another stage with its sacred text. It is the standard view that the Quran is the word of God, all of it. That is not an Islamist view. It's the view of all of Islam. Unfortunately, the Quran is full of numerous murderously intolerant verses. It has some tolerant ones too. And I'm glad we hear a great deal about those. But we are at another stage with Islam. And especially, I think, for those of us who think there's no one up there, we find ourselves sort of, I think, rather nervously embattled. We have, on the one hand, a section of the liberal left tying themselves up in knots to somehow not really confront issues to do with misogyny and homophobia in Islam. And on the other hand, a sense of a religion that can be quite vengeful or quite violent if it feels itself crossed. And yet, on the other hand, a great deal of its community is underprivileged. And so, it's cut through, shot through with all kinds of complications. And certainly thinking freely is not easy.
Sam Harris, in the book The End of Faith, makes, I think, a telling point about terrorists such as those controlled by Osama bin Laden and others. He says, the thing you have to understand is that these people actually believe what they say they believe. And once you grasp that, and as you pointed out, Christians on the whole don't, but people like Osama bin Laden and his disciples actually believe what they say they believe. And if you believe that, then I think it would be quite easy to see how you could do things like the 9/11 atrocity.
Passionate belief, I mean, and we need talk not only of Islam here, but, of revolutionary belief, which is then about means and ends, and how, cracking a few eggs to make an omelette is perfectly acceptable.
Collateral damage, it's sometimes
yes,
called.
or exactly. I mean, the American military, when it wants to achieve its ends, will also crack a few eggs and heads But I think 9/11 was a shock to us all, to confront in the 21st century a kind of passionate belief that we thought belonged in the history books of medieval theology. The kind of paradise on offer to a martyr seems so time-bound. I mean, clearly is a product of medieval and late medieval thinking. And it's the same Sam Harris who suggests that if this paradise was being conjured now, it would involve, a gull-winged DeLorean sports car or a Lexus or a plasma screen TV. I mean, the pleasures are clearly those that were around the time of when God spoke, should I say. So it is extraordinary to think, and who would have thought in the mid-70s, thinking ahead to the 21st century, that religion would be such a powerful force in geopolitics. I mean, in the ways that it was during the days of the Holy Roman Empire or the 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War. I mean, what a surprise this is. And how endlessly fascinating, too. To come back to your Darwinian point about morals and superstitious belief, I mean, perhaps we have to confront the fact that we're hardwired for religion, too. That no amount of rationality or science or modernity is ever going to relieve us of it. This is what we are, most of us.
But because at least some of us are not, doesn't that give hope that education perhaps might be the answer to this problem?
I don't know, because the problem, I think, for atheists is that there are so many very clever, humane, responsible people, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who believe in a sky god and who think that gathering in a large, beautiful barn on a Sunday and sending up your thoughts is actually going to influence future events. I mean, it does seem a remarkable set of beliefs to me, but very, very clever, highly educated people hold with it.
It's been pointed out that if you were the only person who held those beliefs, you'd probably be locked up in an asylum. But because lots of people hold them, it becomes a sort of respectable, accepted thing.
I suppose in the real world in which we have to rub along, the only issue here is tolerance. And who will grant tolerance to the 6,000 religions of the world? Well, surely only the secular spirit is able to do this. You cannot put religious tolerance in the hands of one religion. You have to put it in the hands, I think, of the secular authority, which either believes all of them or none of them, but says that they all must thrive alongside each other. They have mutually exclusive worldviews, just as a secular atheistic humanism is entirely at odds with the worldview of a Christian. But somehow we know that it's only the secular state, only a sort of supervening uncaring about religion that will allow us all the freedoms to be as rational or as crazy as we want to be.
Which was, of course, the ideal under which the American Republic was set up. Jefferson and Washington and their colleagues were deists or atheists, but what they were passionate about was that America, having been founded by immigrants fleeing religious persecution, should never have to undergo that again. And the only way they could achieve that was by setting up a secular state with no state religion. And they must be spinning in their graves at what is happening in America today, which is rapidly degenerating into a theocracy.
One of the most extraordinary reversals in history, isn't it? You have this extraordinary social experiment, America, an immigrant state founded in reaction to the religious absolutisms of old Europe. And then fast forward a couple of hundred years, you have, at least in Western Europe, and more or less entirely secular set of governments and political conversations conducted without any reference to God, while the United States is a place where you cannot hold high office without invoking these deities. Sorry, did I say deities? This deity. But it would be no different if Bush were to summon up Jupiter and Pallas Athene. I mean, whatever happened to those gods anyway? Where are the people to believe in them now? And how quaint they seem, and yet how seriously they were held to exist.
Depressing note on which to end. Ian McEwan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.